September 1987, Radio City Music Hall, New York. 15,000 fans packed into one of America's most iconic venues for what was supposed to be another spectacular stop on Whitney Houston's Moment of Truth World Tour. The energy was electric as Whitney's voice soared through classics that had already made her a global phenomenon. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned until the intimate acoustic section, when something completely unexpected happened. A woman in the third row managed to slip past security during Greatest Love of All and handed Whitney a faded yellow envelope. Most performers would have politely accepted it and continued singing, but when Whitney opened that envelope and began reading what was inside, the greatest voice of a generation cracked completely. She stopped singing mid-verse, sat down on the edge of the stage, and began crying so intensely that her body shook. What was written on that 20-year-old piece of paper was so powerful, so deeply personal, that it shattered Whitney's carefully maintained public persona and revealed the wounded daughter behind the superstar. This wasn't just another concert moment. This was the night Whitney Houston's heart broke open in front of 15,000 witnesses because of 7 words her mother never got to say. The story behind that letter began long before Whitney Houston became a household name. In the cramped backstage dressing rooms of Newark's nightclub circuit, where dreams were born and often died. Her name was Dorothy Williams, and she had been carrying that letter in her purse for 19 years. Not a copy, not a recreation, but the actual yellowed envelope with her mother's distinctive cursive handwriting that had faded but never disappeared. The envelope was worn at the edges from being touched thousands of times, from being held during difficult moments when Catherine needed to feel connected to someone she had lost too soon. Catherine's mother, Dorothy Williams, had been a session singer and backup vocalist in the late 1960s and early 70s, working the same New Jersey gospel and soul circuit that would later produce Whitney Houston. Dorothy had possessed a voice that industry veterans still talked about decades later, a contralto so rich and powerful that it could make hardened producers weep. She had sung backup for Aretha Franklin during a brief stint in 1970, had recorded session work for Atlantic Records, and had been on the verge of her own recording contract when tragedy struck. Dorothy Williams had known Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, during those years when they both navigated the complicated world of session singing. They had shared stages, shared dressing rooms, and shared the particular pain that came from being exceptionally talented black women in an industry that often used their voices without giving them credit or opportunity. The two women had formed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared struggle, though their paths would diverge dramatically in ways neither could have predicted. In 1973, Dorothy Williams was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. She was only 31 years old with a 7-year-old daughter to raise and a music career that was finally beginning to flourish after years of grinding work. The diagnosis came just weeks after she had received interest from Berry Gordy's Motown Records, the dream opportunity she had worked her entire adult life to achieve. But the cancer was relentless, spreading faster than doctors could treat it with the limited medical technology available in that era. As her condition deteriorated rapidly over the following months, Dorothy made the heartbreaking decision to step away from music entirely to focus on treatment and spending whatever time she had left with Catherine. During those final months, Dorothy spent long hours in her hospital room writing letters to the people who had mattered most in her life. She wrote to Catherine, of course, pages and pages of motherly advice and love that her daughter could read as she grew up without her. She wrote to her own mother, to her sisters, to friends who had supported her through the years. But there was one letter that consumed more of her fading energy than any other, a letter addressed to someone who was just a child herself, but who Dorothy believed carried something precious that needed to be protected at all costs. Dorothy had watched young Whitney Houston during various family gatherings and church events where the Houston family would perform. Even as a little girl, Whitney's voice had possessed an otherworldly quality that transcended technical skill. But what haunted Dorothy during her final days wasn't Whitney's talent. It was the look in the child's eyes, a combination of raw ambition and desperate need for approval that Dorothy recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror for years. Dorothy knew the particular kind of hunger that came from growing up in the shadow of a talented, demanding mother, the constant pressure to be perfect, to be worthy, to earn love through achievement rather than simply existing. She saw in young Whitney the same pattern that had nearly destroyed her own relationship with music, the transformation of something joyful into something torturous. During one of Cissy Houston's visits to the hospital, Dorothy had tried to express her concerns, but Sissy had misunderstood, thinking Dorothy was criticizing her parenting. The conversation ended badly, and they never spoke again before Dorothy's death. But Dorothy couldn't let go of her worry for Whitney, this extraordinarily gifted child who seemed to be carrying weights that no child should bear. So Dorothy wrote a letter. She spent 5 days composing it, writing and rewriting until her weakened hands could barely hold the pen. The letter wasn't long, just 2 pages written in her careful cursive on yellow legal paper that she had Catherine bring from home. But every word was chosen with the precision of someone who knew these might be the most important sentences she would ever write. When she finished, Dorothy sealed the letter in a manila envelope and wrote on the outside in large letters that her failing eyesight could still read clearly, "For Whitney Houston, when she needs to remember who she was before the world told her who to be." She gave the envelope to 7-year-old Catherine with instructions that the child was too young to fully understand but old enough to remember. "Catherine, my sweet girl," Dorothy had said, her voice barely a whisper, "someday you're going to hear about Whitney Houston being famous. When that happens, I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll find a way to give her this letter. She's going to need it, baby. She's going to need to hear what I couldn't tell her mama." Catherine had promised, not really understanding what her dying mother meant, but knowing that the promise was important. Dorothy Williams died 3 weeks later, leaving her 7-year-old daughter with a stack of letters, a box of gospel records, and one sealed envelope with a mission attached to it. Over the years, as Catherine grew up without her mother, she kept that sealed envelope safe through multiple moves, through foster care when her grandmother could no longer care for her, through difficult teenage years when she had almost nothing else from her childhood. The envelope became a talisman, a connection to her mother, and a promise she intended to keep even when it seemed impossible. Catherine watched from a distance as Whitney Houston's career exploded exactly as her mother had predicted. She saw Whitney on television, heard her on the radio, watched her become one of the biggest stars in the world. And with each new achievement, Catherine felt the weight of her promise growing heavier. She tried multiple times over the years to deliver the letter through official channels. She sent it to Arista Records with a detailed explanation, but it was returned unopened with a form letter about not accepting unsolicited mail. She tried contacting Whitney's management company, but her calls were never returned. She even attempted to reach Sissy Houston directly, thinking that mentioning her mother's name might open doors. But that attempt resulted in a cease and desist letter from a lawyer warning her about attempting to contact the Houston family. By 1987, Catherine was 26 years old, working as a nurse at Newark Beth Israel Medical Center, the same hospital where her mother had died 14 years earlier. She had long since given up on official channels for delivering the letter, but she had never given up on the promise itself. When she saw that Whitney Houston would be performing at Radio City Music Hall as part of her Moment of Truth tour, something clicked into place. Her mother's words echoed in her memory, when she needs to remember who she was before the world told her who to be. Catherine had been following Whitney's career closely enough to sense that something was wrong behind the carefully managed public image. There were whispers in the industry about Whitney's struggles with the pressure of fame, about conflicts with a record label over musical direction, about personal relationships that were causing stress. Catherine couldn't know the specific details, but she recognized the signs of someone drowning under expectations, someone who had lost touch with the core of who they were beneath all the achievement and acclaim. This was the moment her mother had somehow known would come. Catherine spent nearly her entire savings on a ticket, not for the best seat, but for a strategic position in the third row center section where she might have a chance to reach the stage during a quiet moment. She had no elaborate plan, no scheme to force her way past security. She simply trusted that if her mother had been right about Whitney needing the letter, then somehow the opportunity would present itself. The night of the concert, Catherine sat in her seat, clutching the worn yellow envelope that had been part of her life for 19 years, feeling her mother's presence more strongly than she had since childhood. She had no idea that she was about to witness Whitney Houston at one of her most vulnerable moments, or that the letter in her hands would crack open something in Whitney that had been sealed shut for far too long. The first half of Whitney Houston's concert at Radio City Music Hall had been characteristically flawless. Song after song, she delivered the vocal perfection that had made her famous, hitting notes that seemed impossible while making it look effortless. The audience was entranced, singing along to hits they had played until their cassette tapes wore thin, watching a woman who seemed to have been born without limitations. But Catherine Williams, sitting in the third row with her mother's letter pressed against her chest, noticed something that most of the audience missed. During the upbeat numbers when Whitney was dancing and engaging with the crowd, there was genuine joy in her performance. But during the ballads, especially during the moments when she had to stand still and simply sing, there was something haunted in her eyes. It was subtle, visible only to someone who was looking for it, but Catherine saw it clearly. The same look her mother had described seeing in young Whitney years ago. The look of someone performing not from joy but from obligation, not from passion but from the desperate need to meet impossible standards. The moment Catherine had been waiting for came during the acoustic section of the show, when Whitney moved to a simple stool at the front of the stage to perform Greatest Love of All, the song that had become her signature despite her complicated relationship with its message. This was always the most intimate part of Whitney's concerts, when she stripped away the production and let her voice stand alone in all its devastating power. As Whitney began singing about learning to love yourself, because it was the greatest love of all, Catherine felt something shift in the air around her. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Now, baby, this is when she needs to hear it." Catherine stood slowly, her legs shaking as she approached the small barrier that separated the audience from the stage. Security was lighter during the acoustic section, with guards focusing more on the general crowd than on individual fans in the expensive seats. Whitney was completely absorbed in the performance. Her eyes closed as she poured everything into the lyrics about children being the future and teaching them well. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out the yellow envelope that had waited 19 years for this exact moment. Her mother's handwriting was still clearly visible despite the passage of time. For Whitney Houston, when she needed to remember who she was before the world told her who to be. As Whitney reached the second verse, Catherine did something that surprised even herself. She called out, not loudly enough to disrupt the entire venue, but clearly enough for Whitney to hear over her own singing. Whitney, from Dorothy Williams. Whitney's eyes snapped open at the mention of that name. Dorothy Williams. The name triggered a cascade of memories. The kind church lady with the impossibly beautiful voice who had been friends with her mother, who had looked at young Whitney with such tenderness and concern, who had died when Whitney was just 10 years old. Whitney stopped singing mid-phrase, her voice trailing off as she stared out into the audience, trying to locate the source of the interruption. The band, confused by the sudden stop, gradually fell silent. The entire venue began to quiet as people realized something unusual was happening. Whitney put her hand up to shield her eyes from the stage lights, squinting into the audience. "Ma'am," she said, her voice uncertain and slightly shaky. "What did you say?" Catherine held up the yellow envelope high enough for Whitney to see it. "She was my mother," Catherine called back, her voice breaking with emotion. "Dorothy Williams. She died in 1973, but before she died, she wrote you this letter. She made me promise to give it to you." The Radio City Music Hall audience of 15,000 people fell into stunned silence. Every eye turned to look at the woman holding up a faded envelope, then back to Whitney Houston standing frozen on stage. Whitney walked slowly to the edge of the stage, her sequined gown catching the lights, and knelt down to see Catherine more clearly. "Your mother was Dorothy Williams, the singer," Whitney said, and it wasn't quite a question. "The woman with a voice like warm honey. She and my mama used to sing together." Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She loved you, Whitney. She worried about you. And she wanted you to have this before the world made you forget something important." Whitney looked at the envelope in Catherine's outstretched hand, and for a moment she seemed paralyzed with indecision. The sensible thing would be to accept it graciously, set it aside, and continue the show. 15,000 people had paid good money to see Whitney Houston perform, and stopping the concert for a personal letter from someone who had died 14 years ago wasn't professional. But Whitney Houston had spent her entire life doing the sensible thing, the professional thing, the thing that other people expected of her. In this moment, looking at Dorothy Williams' handwriting on that worn yellow envelope, something inside her cracked open. She reached down and took the letter from Catherine's trembling hands. "Can I?" Whitney started, then paused, her voice thick with emotion. "Can I read this now?" Catherine nodded. "Mama said you'd know when you needed to read it. That's why she made me wait all these years to give it to you. She said the moment would come when you'd need to remember." Whitney sat down right there on the edge of the stage, her legs dangling over the side like a child, and carefully opened the envelope that had waited 19 years to reach her. The massive venue screens showed her face as she unfolded the yellow legal paper, and the entire audience seemed to hold their breath collectively. Whitney's eyes began moving across the page, reading words that Dorothy Williams had written during her final days on Earth specifically for this moment. The letter wasn't long, just 2 pages of careful handwriting that had faded slightly, but remained perfectly legible. As Whitney read, her expression transformed from curiosity to disbelief to something that looked like relief mixed with devastating pain. The audience could see her lips moving slightly as she read silently to herself. Her hands began trembling as she progressed through the first page. When she turned to the second page, she brought one hand up to cover her mouth, and her shoulders started to shake. The Radio City Music Hall audience watched in real time as one of the most powerful voices in music history broke down completely. It was when Whitney reached the final paragraph of the letter that everything shattered. Her face crumpled, tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she started crying with an intensity that made it difficult for her to breathe. The microphone clipped to her costume picked up the sound of her sobbing, and the raw pain in those sounds affected everyone in the venue. People in the audience started crying too, moved by witnessing something so private and profound. Catherine, watching from just below the stage, was crying herself as she witnessed the moment her mother had somehow known would come. "Mama always said you needed to hear it," Catherine called out to Whitney. She said nobody had ever told you the truth about who you really were. Whitney looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face, her makeup running, looking more human and vulnerable than she had ever appeared in public. When she spoke into her microphone, her voice was raw and broken in a way that made the perfection of her singing voice seem like a distant memory. She wrote. Whitney paused, tried to compose herself enough to speak clearly. She wrote that she saw me when I was little. She saw something in me that scared her. The crowd remained in absolute silence. 15,000 people collectively holding their breath. Whitney continued, her voice breaking with emotion. Dorothy wrote that she recognized the look in my eyes because she had seen it in her own mirror. She said I was already learning to perform for love instead of performing from love. That I was already turning myself into what other people needed me to be instead of discovering who I actually was. Whitney held up the letter so the audience could see it, though none of them could read the words from their seats. She spent her dying days writing this because she was worried about a little girl she barely knew. She was worried that I would lose myself trying to be perfect for everyone else. The emotion in Radio City Music Hall was overwhelming. Tough men who had come to hear great singing found themselves openly weeping. Teenagers who idolized Whitney's perfection were confronted with her humanity. Parents held their children closer, thinking about the pressures they might be putting on them without realizing it. Whitney looked directly at Catherine. Your mother wrote that she wished she could protect me from what was coming. From the pressure, from the expectations, from losing touch with the girl who used to sing in church just because it felt like praying, she said, and Whitney's voice cracked completely as she read directly from the letter now. She said, Whitney, I hope you remember that you were loved before you could sing a single note. You were precious before you were useful. You were enough before you were perfect. The 7 words that would change everything came at the end of the letter, words that Dorothy Williams had somehow known Whitney Houston would desperately need to hear nearly 2 decades after they were written. Whitney read them aloud to the 15,000 people watching her breakdown. You are worthy of love simply for existing. Those 7 words, you are worthy of love simply for existing, hung in the air of Radio City Music Hall like a revelation. For Whitney Houston, who had spent her entire life earning love through achievement, proving her worth through perfection, and measuring her value by her ability to meet other people's expectations, hearing that she was worthy simply for existing was devastating in the most beautiful way possible. Whitney stood up slowly, still holding the letter, and walked back to her microphone stand. Her face was streaked with tears, her perfect makeup ruined, her composure completely shattered. But something about her seemed more real, more present than she had been at any point earlier in the concert. Ladies and gentlemen, Whitney said to the crowd, her voice still shaky but growing stronger, I need to share something with you. Dorothy Williams was a beautiful soul whom my mother knew when I was just a little girl. She died when I was 10 years old, and I barely remember her. But she saw something in me that scared her, something I'm only now beginning to understand myself. Whitney held up the letter again. She wrote this on her deathbed, knowing she would never get to see me grow up, never get to see my career, never get to know if her words would reach me. But somehow she knew that I would need to hear this exact message at exactly the right time. The standing ovation that began then wasn't for Whitney's vocal ability or her star power. It was for her courage in being vulnerable, for her willingness to break down in front of 15,000 strangers, for choosing authenticity over perfection in a moment when perfection had been the easier choice. Whitney turned to Catherine, who was still standing near the stage. "Your mother gave me something tonight that I didn't even know I was missing. She gave me permission to be human. She gave me permission to be imperfect. She gave me permission to exist without having to earn it." Catherine climbed onto the stage at Whitney's invitation, and the two women embraced while 15,000 people watched this connection between two daughters, both shaped by the legacy of their mothers, both carrying wounds and wisdom passed down through generations. "I've spent my whole life trying to be worthy," Whitney said into the microphone while still holding Catherine. "Worthy of my mother's talent, worthy of the opportunities I've been given, worthy of the love people show me. But your mother's letter just taught me that I was looking at it backwards. I was already worthy. We're all already worthy. The love isn't something we earn. It's something we remember we've always had." What happened next at Radio City Music Hall was unlike anything that had happened at a Whitney Houston concert before. Instead of returning to her set list and finishing the show as planned, Whitney sat down on the stage floor, still in her sequin gown, and asked Catherine to sit with her. For the next 20 minutes, in front of 15,000 people, the two women talked about Dorothy Williams. Catherine shared stories about her mother that Whitney had never heard, details about the friendship between Dorothy and Sissy Houston, memories of the music scene that had shaped both their lives. Whitney talked about the pressure she had been under, the expectations that felt crushing, the way she had slowly lost touch with the girl who used to sing, just because singing felt like joy. The intimacy of that conversation, broadcast throughout the venue, created a sense of collective witnessing that transcended entertainment and became something closer to communal healing. The impact of Dorothy Williams' letter on Whitney Houston extended far beyond that extraordinary night at Radio City Music Hall. What happened in the weeks, months, and years following that concert revealed just how deeply those 7 words, "You're worthy of love simply for existing," had affected one of the most famous voices in the world. Whitney did finish the concert that night, but everything about her performance was different after reading the letter. Her voice was still technically perfect, but there was a vulnerability and authenticity that hadn't been present in the first half of the show. She sang not to prove anything, but simply to share something beautiful. She dedicated the rest of the concert to Dorothy Williams and to everyone who has ever felt like they had to be perfect to be loved. The audience response was overwhelming, with many people later describing it as the most powerful concert experience of their lives, not because of technical excellence, but because of emotional truth. Backstage after the show, Whitney spent nearly 3 hours with Catherine Williams, learning everything she could about the woman who had cared enough to write her a letter from her deathbed. Catherine shared details about her mother's life, her struggles in the music industry, her talent that never got the recognition it deserved, her final days when she spent her fading energy worrying about a little girl she barely knew. What struck Whitney most was learning about the similarities between Dorothy's experience and her own, the way the music industry had used Dorothy's voice while denying her autonomy, the pressure to be commercially viable rather than artistically authentic, the impossible standards that left no room for humanity or imperfection. She saw in Dorothy's story a warning about what could happen if she continued on her current path, losing herself completely in the pursuit of meeting other people's expectations. During that backstage conversation, Whitney made several decisions that would significantly alter the trajectory of her career and her life. The first decision was to reach out to her mother, Sissy Houston, for a conversation they had been avoiding for years. Dorothy's letter had included a section about the complicated dynamics between mothers and daughters in the entertainment industry, about how love could become entangled with ambition in ways that hurt everyone involved. "I need to talk to my mother," Whitney told Catherine. "Not about business, not about the next album or the next tour. I need to talk to her about us, about whether we've lost something important while building something successful." Within a week of receiving the letter, Whitney had the most honest conversation with Sissy Houston that they had ever had. The details of that conversation remained private, but people close to both women noticed a shift in their relationship afterward. Less performance of the perfect mother-daughter duo for public consumption, more genuine struggle toward authentic connection. The second decision Whitney made was about her music. For years, she had been recording songs chosen by executives and producers, building a career based on commercial appeal rather than personal artistic vision. Dorothy's letter about remembering who she was before the world told her who to be resonated deeply. Whitney began pushing back against her label's control over her musical direction, insisting on more creative input, choosing songs that meant something to her personally rather than just songs calculated to top the charts. This shift would eventually lead to her most critically acclaimed and personally meaningful work, music that came from her soul rather than from market research. The third decision was perhaps the most significant. Whitney had Dorothy Williams' letter professionally framed and placed in her bedroom at her New Jersey home. Friends who visited reported that she would read it before important events, during difficult times, whenever she felt herself slipping back into the pattern of performing for approval rather than living from authenticity. The words "you are worthy of love" simply for existing became a mantra that helped her navigate the increasing pressures of superstardom. Those same words also helped her eventually confront her struggles with addiction and toxic relationships, though that journey would take years and would be far more difficult than anyone watching her breakdown at Radio City Music Hall that night could have imagined. Dorothy Williams and Whitney Houston maintained a close relationship until Whitney's death in 2012. They spoke regularly, with Catherine serving as a connection to a version of Whitney that existed before fame, before expectations, before the machinery of celebrity transformed a girl with an extraordinary voice into a commodity. Whitney would call me when she was struggling, Catherine later shared in interviews. She would say, "Tell me how my mama Dorothy would say." And I would remind her that she was worthy just for existing, that she didn't have to earn love through perfection. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes the addiction and the pain were too strong. But she never forgot what my mother taught her that night. The story of Dorothy Williams' letter spread throughout the entertainment industry, inspiring other artists to examine their own relationships with perfection, approval, and authentic self-expression. Several high-profile musicians cited Whitney's experience as motivation to seek therapy, to repair damaged family relationships, to prioritize mental health over commercial success. The letter became a symbol of the hidden emotional cost of fame and the power of compassion to reach across time and circumstance. When Whitney Houston died, tragically in 2012, Dorothy Williams was invited to speak at her memorial service. She brought her mother's original letter, now framed and preserved, and she read excerpts to a room full of music industry legends, family members, and heartbroken fans. "My mother never got to see Whitney become the legend she became," Catherine said through tears. "She never heard the greatest love of all, or I will always love you. She never saw Whitney at the Super Bowl or in The Bodyguard, but somehow she saw something more important. She saw a little girl who needed to know she was loved just for being herself, not for what she could achieve or how perfectly she could perform. And she spent her dying days making sure that little girl would eventually get that message, even if it took 19 years to deliver it." Catherine shared how Whitney had told her that Dorothy's letter had saved her life multiple times, giving her permission to be imperfect, to struggle, to ask for help without feeling like she was failing. The letter hadn't been able to prevent Whitney's tragic death, but it had given her moments of peace and self-acceptance in a life that offered far too few of those. The legacy of Dorothy Williams' letter continues today through the foundation that Dorothy Williams established in her mother's name. The Dorothy Williams Foundation provides support services for young performers in the entertainment industry, focusing on mental health, authentic artistic development, and protecting young artists from the kind of pressure that could destroy their sense of self-worth. The Foundation's motto, taken directly from the letter, is simple but profound: "You are worthy of love simply for existing." To date, the Foundation has helped hundreds of young artists navigate the complicated terrain of building a career without losing themselves in the process. This beautiful and heartbreaking story reminds us that the most powerful words are often the ones that give us permission to be human, to be imperfect, to exist without having to constantly prove our worth through achievement. Dorothy Williams, a singer whose name most people never knew, whose career was cut short by cancer, whose own dreams were never fully realized, reached across time to offer healing to a woman she had barely known as a child. She saw in young Whitney Houston a pattern that scared her because she recognized it from her own life: the dangerous transformation of artistic joy into obligatory perfection, of self-expression into self-erasure. And she did the most loving thing she could imagine. She wrote down the truth that Whitney would desperately need to hear, sealed it in an envelope, and trusted that somehow it would reach her at exactly the right moment. Who in your life needs to hear that they are worthy of love simply for existing? Who needs permission to be imperfect, to struggle, to be human rather than superhuman? Share this message in the comments below and tag someone who needs to be reminded of their inherent worth. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who is trying too hard to earn love they already deserve. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more incredible stories that show how simple truths spoken at the right moment can change everything. Until next time, remember that you were loved before you were useful, you were precious before you were perfect, and you are worthy simply because you exist.